11 minutes total per week, a 250% increase in dopamine, increase your overall core metabolism. In other words, the number of calories that you burn per day increases in testosterone as a consequence of this practice. Today, we are going to discuss the use of deliberate cold exposure for health and performance. Temperature is a powerful stimulus on our nervous system and indeed on every organ and system of our body. And cold in particular can be leveraged to improve mental health, physical health, and performance, meaning for endurance exercise, for recovering from various forms of exercise, for actually improving strength and power, and for enhancing mental capacity. In order to properly leverage deliberate cold exposure for sake of mental health, physical health, and performance, you have to understand how cold impacts the brain and body. So today we are going to discuss that. We're going to talk about some of the neural circuits and pathways, some of the hormones involved. I promise to make it all clear and accessible, regardless of whether or not you have a scientific background or not. There are important effects of what we call mindset. And the science of mindset tells us that if we are doing something deliberately and we believe that it's going to be good for us, it actually can lead to a different set of physiological effects than if something is happening to us against our will or without our control. Again, when I talk about cold exposure in this episode, I'm talking about deliberate cold exposure, meaning that you are placing yourself into a cold environment on purpose in order to extract a particular set of benefits. When we talk about deliberate cold exposure, almost always that means getting uncomfortable. And one of the most common questions I get when discussing the use of cold is, how cold should it be? How cold should the water be? How cold should the environment be? And I just will tell you now, and I'm going to say this again and again throughout the episode, how cold depends on your cold tolerance, your core metabolism, and a number of other features that no way I could know or have access to. So I would like you to use this rule of thumb. If you are using deliberate cold exposure, the environment that you place yourself into should place your mind into a state of, whoa, I would really like to get out of this environment, but I can stay in safely. Okay, now that might seem a little bit arbitrary, but let's say you were to get into a warm shower and it would feel really, really nice, and you were to start turning down the warm and turning up the cold. There would be some threshold at which it would feel uncomfortable to you. And if you were to continue to make a little bit colder than that, you would really want to get out of the shower, but you were confident that you could stay in without risking your health. What happens when we get into cold is that we experience an increase in norepinephrine, in noradrenaline release, and in adrenaline release. The fact that cold exposure, deliberate or no, increases norepinephrine and epinephrine in our brain and body means that it is a very reliable stimulus for increasing norepinephrine and epinephrine. That's sort of an obvious statement, but that obvious statement can be leveraged to systematically build up what we call resilience. Now, when we experience a stressor in life, whether or not it's something bad happens in our relationship or something bad happens in the world and we feel stress, that stress is the consequence of increases in norepinephrine and epinephrine in our brain and body. Very similar, if not identical, to the kinds of increases that come from deliberate cold exposure. So deliberate cold exposure is an opportunity to deliberately stress our body, and yet we can learn to maintain mental clarity. We can learn to maintain calm while our body is in a state of stress. And that can be immensely useful when encountering stressors in other parts of life. And that's what we call resilience or grit, our ability to, or mental toughness, our ability to lean into challenge or to tolerate challenge while keeping our head straight, so to speak. So one simple protocol for increasing resilience is to pick a temperature that's uncomfortable, of shower or cold immersion, and then to get in for a certain duration of time, and then to get out. So the way to think about norepinephrine and epinephrine in this context of building mental resilience is that you have two options. You can either try to extend the duration of time that you are in the deliberate cold exposure, so going from 1 minute to 75 seconds to 2 minutes and so on over a period of days. Or one way to approach this, and the way that I particularly favor, is to take the context of the day and the moment into account, meaning we have different levels of grit and resilience on different days, and depending on the landscape of our life at the time, even the time of day that we're doing these protocols, and start to be able to sense the release of epinephrine, and norepinephrine in our brain and body, and see those as walls that we want to climb over in order to build resilience, and to start counting the number of walls that we traverse and the distance between those walls as we do deliberate cold exposure. Okay, the next question that I always get is, what should my mental state be while I'm exposing myself to this uncomfortable yet safe condition of cold? Well, you have two options, and there are probably other options as well. One is to try and calm yourself, to remain as mentally still as possible. The other is to lean into that challenge, and so to grind it out. Sometimes it's easier to calm yourself. One way to do that is through double inhales through the nose and extended exhales through the mouth, or simply by trying to control your breathing and reduce the pace of your breathing and increase the volume of your breathing. I have to say that everyone experiences a shortening of breath when they get into uncomfortably cold water. That is a universal physiological response. Everyone also experiences a 30 to 80% decrease in cognitive function, in particular of the frontal cortex. The metabolism of your frontal cortex goes down. The metabolism, meaning the activity of brain areas associated with stress and panic, goes way up. And so anchoring your mind in cognitive activities as you get into the cold can be very, very helpful for maintaining clarity of mind. In fact, one thing that I sometimes recommend is that people try and engage in some sort of cognitive exercise while in the cold, not as a form of distraction, but as a way to maintain clarity of thinking and to learn how to do that when the body is flooded with all these chemicals that make us stressed. So for instance, you could do math problems, and not 2 + 2 = 4, not 3 × 3 = 9, but things that require a little bit more focus and attention, working memory, and so forth. Another very common question is how often to do deliberate cold exposure. It's tough to make a recommendation on that based on any peer-reviewed study, although there are a few in humans that point to a threshold of 11 minutes total per week. So that's total throughout the week, divided into 2 or 4 sessions of 2 or 3 minutes or so. Deliberate cold exposure has a very powerful effect on the release of dopamine in our brain and body. And this is one of the main reasons why people continue to do deliberate cold exposure. Basically, it makes us feel good, and it continues to make us feel good even after we get out of the cold environment. In fact, some people would say they don't feel good in the cold environment. It's all stress for them, but afterwards they feel great. Now, the most interesting data to me, at least in terms of mental effects of deliberate cold exposure, were that the plasma increased 530%. These are huge increases in norepinephrine. The subjects also experienced a 250% increase in dopamine concentrations, which, while not 530% as it was with norepinephrine, is still a very large increase in baseline levels of dopamine. And what was interesting is that those increases in dopamine persisted for a very long period of time afterwards, even out to 2 hours. Okay, and they stopped the study after 120 minutes of getting out of the cold, but nonetheless, these increases in norepinephrine are huge and long-lasting, and these increases in dopamine are very large and long-lasting. And I do believe that these documented effects in humans explain much of the enhancement of attention and of feelings of well-being and mood that people typically experience after doing deliberate cold exposure. And the reason I say that is that if you were to go back to the episode that I did on dopamine, what you would find is that increases in dopamine of the sort evoked by deliberate cold exposure are actually very similar to the kinds of increases in dopamine that are elicited by things like nicotine or from other behaviors that are known to be addictive and bad for us because they lead to other effects on the brain and body that we simply don't want. And yet, deliberate cold exposure, provided it's done safely, can create similar, if not greater, increases in dopamine that are not just fleeting, that don't just occur during, say, the consumption of some deleterious drug or activity, but that are very long-lasting and that can be leveraged toward activities other than deliberate cold exposure. And yet, almost everybody who does deliberate cold exposure will say, yeah, it was stressful, I didn't enjoy it, or I eventually grew to like it, but that I always feel better afterwards, and then that feeling lasts a very long period of time. And I think it's almost certain that those experiences that people report relate to these increases in dopamine, and in concert with the increases in norepinephrine, also explain the other effect that's commonly reported, which is an enhancement in mental acuity and the ability to focus. You can also do a combined protocol whereby you ingest caffeine 60 to 120 minutes before the deliberate cold exposure. As I talked about earlier, dopamine can increase quite substantially in response to deliberate cold exposure, but dopamine on its own doesn't do anything. It has to bind to receptors, and this paper shows quite definitively that ingesting caffeine, in this case it was 300 milligram dose of caffeine, which is about the dose of caffeine in 2 or 3 cups of coffee. It depends on the strength of the coffee, of course. That increases the density and or efficacy of these receptors, which would allow that dopamine to have its greatest effect. And for those of you that want to get really, really fancy, I suppose you could do this fasted, so you get the further increase in norepinephrine, and you get the dopamine increase from the cold exposure, the binding of the dopamine. But if you're getting up in the morning and you're fasted because you haven't eaten all night and you have a cup of coffee, and then 60 minutes later you take your cold shower, or 2 hours later you do your cold immersion or your cold shower, you would be layering together these different mechanisms of dopamine receptors, epinephrine, and so forth in a way that, at least to me, doesn't seem incompatible with having some other life, like going to school and having relationships, etc. Deliberate cold exposure converts one particular kind of fat cell, the white fat cell, which is a very low metabolic output cell. It's basically a storage site for energy in the body, fat cells, to a different type of fat cell, which is the beige fat cell, or even to brown fat cells, which are very dark under the microscope, and dark because they contain mitochondria and are very metabolically and thermogenically active. Beige fat and brown fat acts as sort of a furnace, or the sort of fat that you would find in a candle, a fuel that can increase core body temperature. So beige fat and brown fat is very good at raising our metabolism and helps burn white fat. Now, of course, it does that only in the context of a caloric deficit, but it can actually help create that caloric deficit. Having more beige fat and brown fat can increase your overall core metabolism. In other words, the number of calories that you burn per day, and therefore the number of calories that you need to either maintain or to lose weight. Should you get into the heat afterward, or before, or not at all? That to achieve the greatest increases in metabolism through deliberate cold exposure, you want to force yourself to reheat on your own after the deliberate cold exposure, meaning you wouldn't want to go from the cold shower to a hot shower, or from the cold shower to a sauna. Rather, if you were going to start with a hot shower, or you're going to start with a sauna, that you would end with the cold, and then you would reheat naturally. If you want to increase your metabolism, end on cold. That's the Soberg principle. And as best you can, try and get to the point where you are shivering either when you are in the cold exposure or immediately afterwards. Now, as a final topic related to the use of deliberate cold exposure for improving health and performance, of using deliberate cold exposure to the groin, in particular to the testicles, in order to try and increase testosterone. I can imagine, based on what I know about the nervous system, testosterone and cold, etc., that there are a couple of mechanisms by which one might experience increases in testosterone as a consequence of deliberate cold exposure. One could, of course, take a cold shower. One could, of course, use cold immersion of various kinds, and you're still going to get that exposure of the groin and the testicles to cold. Now, I should point out that people do report, at least anecdotally, increases in testosterone as a consequence of this practice. And I have to imagine that they are measuring their serum testosterone, that they're not just guessing that their testosterone went up. Anytime you cool a body surface, that if it's cold enough, you're going to get vasoconstriction, and then subsequently you're going to get a rebound increase in vasodilation, meaning you're going to constrict the blood vessels in that area, and then after the cold is removed, there's going to be more blood flow to that area. And of course, blood flow relates to organ health and tissue health generally, so perfusion of that region and those and the gonads, to be specific, with additional blood, you could imagine in some ways increasing testosterone. That's reasonably plausible. The other probably more likely mechanism relates to the dopamine increases caused by cold exposure that we talked about earlier. Again, anytime you have a somewhat stressful stimulus, but in particular with cold exposure, it seems that the catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine all increase. And dopamine is known to be in the pathway that can stimulate testosterone. If you are going to do deliberate cold exposure, you are going to increase your core body temperature. And that makes sense if you think about how deliberate cold exposure can increase metabolism by increasing thermogenesis. What that all means is that if you are doing your deliberate cold exposure early in the day, you are going to get yet a further increase in core body temperature that would be associated with wakefulness, your ability to be alert that morning or throughout the day, and so on.